So the job of an API integration developer with APIANT is very different than another typical API integration development project, because you will be using our platform to build these integrations. So first, let me show you what the customer sees, and then I'll show you how you will build these integrations. So what our integration is really, you can see we have 15,267 apps in our catalog. So you could do a search for, any apps, for instance. So if I said Salesforce, for instance, right, this would be the Salesforce app. And for each one of these apps, we have a list of endpoints, which are endpoints that we essentially get from the API. So these are all the triggers that are available for Salesforce, and these are all the actions that are available for Salesforce that we have already implemented. So if they have a check mark, it means it's already done. So the customer can start using it in building their automations. If you look below, if there's a plus next to it, it just means that we've documented from the API that the endpoints are available, or we could implement these endpoints, but they haven't been implemented yet. So what typically happens is that customers will look at this and say, I really need to build an automation with Salesforce, but I really need the new folder trigger, right? This is a trigger called new folder in Salesforce, which is not available if I signed up right now. So they can come here and then they say new folder, and then they look at their order. So I'll delete the previous one here. So you can see that, in their cart, we just added Salesforce trigger new folder, and then they can submit the request. When they submit the request, it's going to create an order, and essentially, once they pay for it, we have to implement the new folder trigger in Salesforce. Now, why is that important to them? Well, it's important because once that new endpoint is available, they can start building automations. So I'll just describe what this is. This is the automation editor. So the automation editor is a very user-friendly way for our customers to connect their apps and start, integrating and automating their apps. So in this case, you can see that this is the Shopify new order trigger. So on the left is triggers, and on the right are actions, right? Just like, so if I look at Shopify, which is another app, right? So if I look at Shopify, these are the triggers and these are the actions, right? A trigger means, something is happening that is going to launch the automation, and the action is something that will happen during the execution of the automation. So looking at this again, here there's a trigger called when there's a new order in Shopify, then go ahead and create a new invoice in QuickBooks, which is an action, then create a new task in Salesforce, which is an action, then send a message in Slack, which is an action. Now these actions can also emit data to the next action. So when we get to create a new task in Salesforce, we could essentially grab data from not only the Shopify order from the trigger, but we could also grab data from the create new invoice QuickBooks invoice. So we could include, for instance, a link to the invoice. And, when you send the Slack message, you could grab data from the 3 previous apps that were touched through the API. So we could say to the sales manager, there was a new order. Here's the detail of the order. We created an invoice. Here's the link to the invoice. And a task was created in Salesforce. And here's some information about the customer in Salesforce. So this is how the user ends up using these endpoints. So what are we looking for you guys to do? Well, what you guys are going to do is you're going to implement these endpoints, right? So you see this new order trigger. You're going to actually implement the API endpoint. And I'm going to show you how we do it, because we do it with this thing called the assembly editor. Now, before I show you the assembly editor, when people place their orders right here, this is what it looks like. And I'll show you, what these orders look like. So, we'll say, for instance, we'll say, Yasir, we have a new order for you to implement. So here's are the orders. Well, actually, let me log in as a different user so I can show you the actual orders, what they look like. Okay. So these are the orders as they come in. And you can see that, for instance, today, you know, we had all these orders that were submitted. So let's take one, for example. Let's take the last one here. If I look at this order, this person wanted to implement the trigger new issue in Jira, right, which is another app. So the way they did that is that they came here, they went to Jira, right? And they, let me see. Yeah, they went to Jira and then they added the trigger new issue. So they just came here and they said, new issue, I want this for my automations. So they clicked on that, they submitted it, and then the order showed up here. Now we are reviewing the order, we're giving it an ETA, right? And then we tell them how much it's gonna cost for us to implement this order, this new endpoint. And then we're going to hand it over, let's say, to Yasir and say, Yasir, go ahead and implement the new issue trigger in Jira. So now the big question is, how do we do that, right? So let me go to, first to the automation editor, right? So this is the automation editor, which is the tool that our customers use to build automation. So when they create an automation, they come here and, you know, if I looked at Jira, for instance, right now, you can see that there are no triggers available in Jira. They have all plus. If they had a check mark, it means it would be already implemented. Right now, if they come here and they say new issue, it's going to send them to the order page, right? Because it hasn't been implemented. But if I chose another app as a trigger, let's say like Gmail, right? And I said, well, I want to do a trigger for Gmail. These are all the implemented endpoints. So anything with a check mark, I can start using it. So I could say new email from search, right? And now I can start putting a filter, put a search query. Let's say I'm searching for Amir. So any email that comes in that says Amir will now be, you know, will trigger this automation. So now it's waiting for all my emails and it's waiting for the search query Amir. And if I get an email that says Amir, then for instance, I could send an SMS to myself and say, oh, Amir is very important to me. So I want to make sure I get an SMS that I got an email. Or I could say, you know, let's do an email forwarding, for instance. So I could send another email and say, when I get an email from Amir, I'm going to send an email to, you know, to Fred at apiant.com. And I'm going to say, you know, here, and then here you can start mapping the fields from the trigger into the action. So here I could say, you know, from, which is from the trigger, right? So just sent me an email. Just sent me an email. And then the body, I could say this is the email body. So the email body in HTML. So what I've done here is I just created a very simple automation that says when there's a new email from Amir, go ahead and send me an email, right? And which typically you wouldn't do that. You would just do that in Gmail. But this is what this does, right? Send me an email, and then I started mapping the fields from the trigger. So this is how you do the automation editor. And then you can add, you know, new endpoints. I could say, oh, and I also want to add, you know, a tag in Agile CRM, and I want to add a tag to my Amir account. So I haven't connected my Agile CRM right now, so it's asking me to connect it. But you can see that you can basically build any kind of automation that you want. So this is what the customer uses. So now let's talk about your job, which is to build these endpoints. Essentially, what you're going to do is you're going to implement these endpoints so they are available to the customer to build these automations. So it's called the assembly editor. Now the assembly editor is a very powerful, you know, development platform that was developed over the course of about 10 years. And it allows you to do a lot of things with API integration. So let's take a look at an automation here. I'll just discard this automation and look at another one. Let's look at one, for instance, here. Let's look at this one. So this automation right here, actually, I chose a complicated one. Sorry, let me choose a simple one. Here it is. So this automation is very straightforward, right? It says when there's a new contact in Salesforce, go ahead and send me an email, right? I just did that as an example for my demo here. So this is the, this is the new contact, endpoints, and it has no filters, right? So any new contact in Salesforce, go ahead and send me an email in Gmail, right? And in Gmail, we send an email. Here's the subject. We're grabbing the field from the new contact trigger, was just added, right? So this is very straightforward. So let's take a look at first let's take a look at the trigger. So we'll look at the new contact in Salesforce. What does it look like in the assembly editor? So the assembly editor essentially is comprised of two essential components. First, modules, right? And then assemblies. So a module is one of about 150 different things that you might want to do in an API integration scenario. So now I'm talking to developers, so you guys are really going to get this. So for instance, let's say you wanted to do OAuth, in your integration. You could just come here and type OAuth, right? And then this is the OAuth 2.0 module. And whenever you use this in an assembly, you are performing the task. It's basically kind of a code snippet in some sort. You are performing the task of doing OAuth 2.0. You could even look at the, how this was constructed. You can even change the UI of that module. So here I can just see a preview of that module. So this is what it looks like, right? But even better, you can even look at the code that is powering that module. So this is the code that powers the OAuth 2.0 module. Now, why are we having modules and not just code? Well, the reason for that is that it makes things a lot simpler and a lot faster to implement. So, for instance, if I had the OAuth 2.0 module in about, 2,000 different, API integration endpoints, and I wanted to make a change to it, right? Let's say I wanted to make a change to the code, then I wouldn't have to touch all these endpoints. They would all inherit that change. So that's one of the huge benefits of having modules, for instance, rather than having to reuse code over and over. Because you could imagine that if I changed OAuth 2.0, and let's say I needed to change some code because it was a little buggy or something was happening, and I had, let's say, 5,000 endpoints that were using it, I would have to make that change in 5,000 endpoints. Now I don't have to do that because I just changed that module, and that module is being used in all these assemblies. So this is one of the modules. So there's a lot of different modules. There's about, like I said, about 150 of them. Modules for processing, modules for, I could do modules for a URL parameter, for instance. So let's take a look at, let me do a refresh here. All right, so let's take a look at the module for, a URL param that you don't have to code by hand because you're using modules now. So URL, let's just do a search for URL. And here's the URL builder, right? So what this does, it just builds a URL. Let's say if you were going to do a webhook, for instance, you can just build a URL. And same thing here. You can look at it here, look at the code behind it, so you can really learn about how this is a very short piece of code, how we build this, which is, the code is in Java, by the way. So when modules are put together, they make assemblies. So remember when I was showing you this endpoint here called the new contact in Salesforce endpoint? So let's take a look at that module. So let me close this here. I'm going to go to the apps in the assemblies. I'm going to go to the Salesforce app. So each app is essentially a service, right? It's an API service. So let's go to Salesforce. All right. And you can see that in Salesforce, there are three things. There are the service itself, which is to make that Salesforce service available to triggers and actions. And then there are actions and triggers for that Salesforce app. So if I come back to our homepage, right? And if I look at Salesforce, right? These are the triggers and the actions. So now take a look at this. The ones with a check mark means they've been implemented, and the one with a plus means they haven't been implemented. So how does that relate to our assembly editor? Well, let's take a look at, you know, Salesforce here. Let me just move that here. Sorry. Okay, so let's take a look at Salesforce. Look at the actions. You can see the grade one, the one that are in gray have not been implemented, which means they are empty. There is no assembly. But the ones that are bold have been implemented. So we can see create custom object, create new task, find object, find user, two-way sync task, update custom object, right? If I come here, it matches those, right? And anything that's gray matches those right here because they haven't been implemented, right? Does that make sense? Right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then same for the trigger. Same for the trigger. I look at the trigger here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 implemented endpoints for the trigger. Oh, sorry, I was looking at the action versus the trigger. So the 7 in the trigger are the 7 here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 actions. So if I look at the actions, these are the actions that have been implemented here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So let's open this new contact trigger for Salesforce to see what it looks like. So I'm going to go to the trigger here in Salesforce, and I'm going to open the new contacts. I'm going to double click on it. And now it's loading the assembly, which is essentially all these modules patched together to make the API, to implement the API endpoint called new contact in Salesforce. And you can see that each, you know, component or each module has a purpose. So here's a text builder. Here's a service credential. So this is how we make sure that they log in with their credentials. Here's a URL builder endpoint. Here's an OAuth transaction. So I'm not a developer. So at that point, you know, you'll have to be trained by a developer to make sure how to use this. But the idea is that now you can start build and modifying these, right? And there's a way to use all of this. So you can disconnect it, add new modules. For instance, I could come here and I could say, you know, I need a new module for this one. I need a, I don't know, a push data module. So I'll add this module here, and then I'll connect it where it belongs and all that stuff. I'm going to close this up because I'm actually working on a live server. So I'm going to close this so I don't save it, because that would be pretty bad if I save that. So, right. So this is how we build these automations, and we build these endpoints, right? So let me go back to the assembly, and then I want to show you one more thing. But the job essentially is to build these assemblies together so they become available to the customer after they've ordered it, so then they can build automations in the automation editor. So once you add the assembly and we bring them on live, they will then be available here, you know, and I could look at, for instance, active campaign, right? And then active campaign, these endpoints that are here that you implement will move up here, and then the customer can start using them in their automation. So let's look at one more thing that I want to show you, then we can have questions. Here's one more thing that I want to show you that show you the power of what it is that we're building here. Here's why it's very, very powerful. Because if you look at this automation here, this is called an automation called when Todoist two-way sync new and updated task, or Salesforce two-way sync new and updated task. So what this means is this is a two-way sync between Todoist, which is an app, right? So here's Todoist right here. Just take a look at Todoist. Just an app with another API, right? It's using this endpoint called two-way sync new and updated task, right? So this says when there is a new task in Todoist, go ahead and create a task in Salesforce and create a relationship between the two, so it's two-way sync. In the same token, it also says when there's a new task in Salesforce, do the same, create a task in Todoist, and make sure there's a relationship between the two. And then when any of these tasks are modified, so this is a trigger here to make sure that when they're modified, it's going to find the it's going to find the sister task essentially in the opposite app and modify it as well. So as a result, this whole automation here, what it does is, if you know an assistant is at the office on Salesforce and she creates a task in Salesforce, well, the salesperson on the road who's connected through this account will see a task created in his Todoist app. And if, for instance, something happens and the meeting has to be changed and he wants to change the date, then this automation will recognize that that endpoint, or I'm sorry, that task was changed, and it will come back and change it back in Salesforce as well. And then we'll continue to do that. Now, there's a couple other things that are happening here in this automation. We have lookup values. So these are APIANT created, actions. And what this does is that it basically gives the user an ability to match values. So 0 for Todoist may mean not started in Salesforce, and 1 in Todoist may be completed in Salesforce, for instance. And then there's a couple other ones here where, 1, 2, 3, 4 in Todoist may be low. I'm sorry, in Todoist may be low, normal, high priority in Salesforce. So what these lookup tables do is if I go to Todoist and I say, oh, I want to make this task a high priority, right? Number 4, well, because it was changed, it's going to look at this table and then it's going to go to Salesforce, and Salesforce doesn't have, 1, 2, 3, 4. It only has low, normal, and high, and it will change that task to high. So this is what these lookup tables do here. But let me just conclude by showing you the assemblies for these two-way sync, endpoints, because this is where you guys are going to really realize the power of APIANT here. So let's go to the assembly editor, right? I'm going to close these right here. And I'm going to go look at Salesforce and Todoist, right? So let's go to the assemblies. Let's go to Salesforce first. All right, and here is the trigger two-way sync new and updated. So when I open this, you can see that it's a pretty complicated assembly. There's some inline code in here. Sometimes, we'll put some Java code if needed. It can also handle PHP and JavaScript. But the most important part of this endpoint that I wanted to show you here, which is not very big. You see, this is the whole implementation of the two-way sync new and updated task trigger in Salesforce. But the thing that I really wanted to show you that is very exciting to us is this module here. You see this module? It's called trigger two-way sync module, right? And now let's look at the Todoist. Let's look at the Todoist action that's going to go with it, right? So I'm going to go look at the two-way sync, action in Todoist, and you'll notice that this action, which is also very different, but also not. You see how simple it is? These 1, 2, 3, 4 modules are the full implementation of creating and updating a task in Todoist. Pretty impressive stuff. But the thing that I really wanted to show you that's really exciting is this thing right here. You see, this is another module called Action Two-Way Sync in Todoist. Now, why is this important? Well, I'll show you why it's important. It's because these modules take care of the full two-way sync methodology and functionality. So if I go here into the modules, and this is where you realize the power of modules, I'm going to do a search for two-way sync, just two-way. And then I'm going to look at just modules. And you can see that there are 2 modules, one called Action Two-Way Sync module and one called Trigger Two-Way Sync module. And all they are, they're little modules that look like not much. But what these modules do, when they are dropped in an endpoint, as long as the endpoint is matched with, another endpoint that has two-way sync, it will create a full two-way sync integration between these two. And again, this two-way sync, we can look at it, look at the implementation. This is the code that goes behind it, right? So as a result, in this particular case, these two-way sync, this is a trigger two-way sync, and this is an action two-way sync. These 2 modules that were used in these two endpoints give us the ability of having a full two-way sync automation between Todoist and between Salesforce. And so because it's a module, see, we didn't hard code a two-way sync Todoist and two-way sync Salesforce. We use these modules, which I just lost. Where are they? Yeah, we use these modules right here and put them in those, in those endpoints. But what does this mean? It essentially means, and this is the most exciting, it means that because of these new modules called two-way sync, we could essentially do two-way sync between any of these apps, any of these 15,000 apps. If I create a new endpoint, I could take this new public post by you, and I could create a two-way sync new public post by you by simply adding the module in its right place, of course. So the thing that I want to close with before we open it up for question is that, how do you know what to put where here and which modules go and how does this work? Well, this is where we really need developers to build these things, because the first thing that we do is we look at the API documentation. So here, this is a two-way sync new and updated task for Salesforce. So the first thing we do is we'd go to Salesforce API, and we'd look at the documentation, and see, so here's the Salesforce API as developer.salesforce.com, and we start reading on the REST API. We'd start reading about how do you implement this endpoint and how do you do, task in Salesforce. And so this is really going to drive what kind of modules are you going to use and how are you going to implement this endpoint. And most of the time, guys, we very rarely build things from scratch anymore. Most of the time, if we recognize that this endpoint is very similar to another API that we've implemented, we'll start from that. So what we'll do is we may say, you know what, and I'm saying this without knowing, so I'm not actually saying this, but I'm just giving you this as an example. We may say, well, you know what, the new task in Salesforce endpoint is very similar to the new task endpoint in Asana, for instance. So then what we would do, and then we would help you with that. We would basically tell you, why don't you start from the Asana endpoint, because it's a very similar API implementation. So we would say, go to the Asana, and you'd come to the Asana endpoint, and then you'd look at the new task in project in Asana, you'd open that, and okay, so right now you're going to use this essentially as a template. So this would be the template for Asana endpoint, right? And we'll say, this is very similar to Salesforce. So now you're going to create a copy of this, right? And you're going to use this as a template to get started in implementing, the Salesforce new task. And then you're going to delete the modules that you need. You're going to reconfigure and all of that stuff. So in a nutshell, and thank you for your patience, this is the power of APIANT. We do API integration and automation. We give our customers the ability to build their own automations. Sometimes we'll build it for them, but what we do better than anyone is that we're able to implement all these endpoints from all these apps very quickly because of the assembly editor. And now I need some water.
That was awesome, actually.
Thank you. You guys get it? You guys have any questions?
Oh, well, it's really pretty clear, and thank you for that detailed presentation and detailed insight in this wonderful project of yours, and you have pretty much made everything clear to us. Thank you.
Wonderful. So one of the approach would be, because again, with great power comes sometimes a pretty steep learning curve. So this is not your typical API integration where you're going to start writing some PHP code, to do what you're used to doing. You're going to have to learn a whole new, way of doing integration. So we've got some training videos. We've got a manual. What we would probably start by doing is probably give you, you guys a couple tests, endpoints to build. The good news is the initial learning curve is going to be pretty steep. So, it's probably going to take you about a couple of weeks to really get to learn the interface and the development platform. But once you do, here's the beautiful thing about this is that once you start mastering this tool, you can start building endpoints very, very quickly, because now you can really leverage a lot of the, a lot of the work that was previously done. And then the best part is that, all developers can benefit from each other, because once I implement an endpoint, let's say this Asana, new task in Asana, then I've done a lot of work in helping you build new endpoints for Asana. Because you see here, this is the Asana. This is not an endpoint. This is not a trigger or an action. This is just to connect to the Asana app. So this is already done. So if you're going to add another endpoint, you don't need to redo that. You can start calling that service into your task. So yeah.
And Fred, there was a scenario where you have to write a code in case if it is not, the option is not available in assembly. What was that scenario?
Yeah, so there are cases where you may find that it's a lot easier to write a little snippet of code to fix a particular hurdle that you may run into. So let me give you an example here. We have an app called Maven Link, and Maven Link is a project management app. So I'll show it to you here. So this is Maven Link, which is a great app. We actually use it to manage our projects. So Maven Link is a project management tool, right? That does project management, project accounting, resource planning, and all of that. So this is what Maven Link does. Well, we've implemented the Maven Link app, and let me just discard this. I have to always remember to discard things because I don't want to be saving some changes here because I'm actually logged in as an admin. So here's a Maven Link app. So right here. And here there is a new invoice trigger in Maven Link. So in Maven Link, you can actually create an invoice, right? So it's one of the features. You can create an invoice. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to be able to, when there's an invoice created, to implement this trigger so we can actually use this information and send invoices to QuickBooks, right? But the issue was we needed to make some changes to some of the formatting. So for instance, so this is the Maven Link trigger, right? So this is the whole thing right here. So you can see there's, I don't know, about a dozen boxes, a dozen modules, sorry. I should really use the right terminology. So here's something that we did. We put a little bit of code in here. And this is some JSP code. And you can see that I can, so if I click here, by the way, I would be editing the code of the module, right? But this module is a module that does inline code. And if I click here, I actually edit the code that I'm using for the integration, right? Do you understand the difference? So if I came here, this would be the code behind the module. So this is the functionality of the module. And this is the code that the module has in there that we want to use in this integration. So in this case, we put some JSP code to do some reformatting of some data, for instance. And we found that it was a lot easier to write some code than having to use a module to reformat the XML. So we needed to reformat some of that XML. So that's why we did this here. In this case here, if I keep on going down, in this case, we didn't need to write code, but what this is doing, these modules, they actually convert, I think they convert cents to dollars because they worked in cents and we needed to work in dollars to go to QuickBooks. And then if you keep on going down here, you'll see that here we convert minutes to hours. Now it says dollars, but it's actually just 60 minutes. So sometime you'll find that, you know what, I need to do some XML reformatting. I'm going to use the extension server-side script module, which is one of the modules in here. I don't know exactly where it is. You would use the module and you would just go in there and then put some code to reformat the data stream, right? The string, which is an XML stream that had to be reformatted. Now there's a bunch of things you may want to do in code, and it all depends on the case scenario. What we would say to you guys is if you feel you need to use some code, you would have to check with our head of development first, because he might be able to save you a lot of time and say, well, you know what, there's a module for that. You know, there's a module you can use called, you know, the fetch paginated result breadcrumbs, for instance, that you could use instead of having to code it. So it all depends on the case.